I'm Bob Lederer here with Pauline Park. With the rise of far-right governments in this country and worldwide hurtling toward a latter-day racist and anti-queer fascism, it's all the more urgent to study important forms of anti-fascism from the past. One such example is from Nazi Germany, the clandestine resistance group called the White Rose. Tonight, we're spending the hour with Dr. Jud Newborn, an anthropologist who has analyzed all forms of Nazism and the Holocaust, and is also one of the world's foremost historians of the White Rose. He's particularly focused on their most celebrated members, siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, and helped bring to light that Hans was a gay man prosecuted for homosexuality years before he helped form the White Rose. More about Dr. Newborn's background in a minute, but first, here are some excerpts from his writing.
The White Rose's core consisted of 6 University of Munich students and a philosophy professor. All but one were executed in 1943 by guillotine within days of their arrest. At the time, Sophie was 21 and Hans was 24. A loose network of supporters and sympathetic acquaintances aided by distributing leaflets and providing money to purchase supplies. Today, Hans and Sophie Scholl are celebrated as pivotal members of the White Rose. They joined the activist network after becoming disillusioned with the Hitler Youth, in which they were both leaders as teenagers. Castigating the German middle class for abandoning its Christian values and leadership roles, the White Rose set out to rouse the masses from their slumber and encourage effective passive resistance against the fascist regime. And here, let me insert into Dr. Newborn's narrative a quote from a White Rose leaflet. "Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct." Back to Dr. Newborn. By all accounts, the White Rose activists were among the first within Germany to speak out widely against the mass murder of Jews in their second leaflet in June 1942. Their legendary distribution of flyers at the University of Munich appears to have been the only fundamentally political public protest against Nazism to be staged by Germans during the 12 years of Adolf Hitler's rule. The last words of the group's fourth leaflet became its legacy. Quote, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." End of quote. 80 years after their executions, leaders of the White Rose are counted among the greatest Germans of all time. Numerous schools, streets, and plazas are named for them, and monuments honoring their activism appear throughout the country. They've been the subject of plays, documentaries, feature films, and even 2 operas. Yet 2 mysteries about the Weiße Rose long bedevil lay people and scholars alike. What motivated the 1937 transformation of the teenage Hans and Sophie from fanatical acolytes of Nazism to passionate anti-Nazis? And why did Hans and his friends choose the White Rose, Weiße Rose, as a name associated with their resistance organization? The answers to these questions appear to be interwoven. According to previously ignored Gestapo interrogation transcripts, along with my own subsequent research, writes Dr. Jud Newborn, anti-gay Nazi policies played a pivotal role in the radicalization of the Scholl siblings, helping to turn them into exemplars of civil courage.
And again, our guest is Dr. Jud Newborn, a pioneer in the creation of modern Holocaust museums, who served as founding historian of New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. Dr. Newborn is an acclaimed multimedia storyteller, lecturer, author, and 2-time Emmy Award winner who has presented his programs coast to coast at the United Nations and from Canada to Cape Town. He is co-author of the now classic book, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, which has been reprinted repeatedly, most recently in the updated 80th anniversary edition of 2023, and has been translated into many languages. He's also written for the New York Times, Jerusalem Post, and Smithsonian Magazine, among other leading publications. He's also a longtime member of the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, or NLGJA. Dr. Newborn was honored in 2018 with the prestigious Spirit of Anne Frank Human Rights Award. Jud Newborn today is the producer of special guest programs for Long Island's Cinema Arts Center, which for years has been a solid supporter of WBAI. Dr. Jud Newborn, thanks for joining us on Out FM.
Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be on your program and WBAI, which has done so much of positive reporting in the last decades.
Let's start by having you give us the capsule history of the White Rose as it was known to you and your co-author Annette Dumbach when you first published your book, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, in 1986, including that description the ideologies of the group's members.
Well, in 1986, the White Rose still was described mostly in terms of the book written by their sister after the war, Inga Scholl. Inga Scholl uh, wrote a kind of fairy tale-like story in 1952 for Germans who still considered the White Rose and others to be traitors who had stabbed them in the back. So she wanted to write something, I believe, that would be palatable. And so she basically transformed the White Rose students, in particular her brother and sister, into apolitical Christian martyrs. Uh, and during in Germany, 1933 to 1945 was like a big hole in teachers teaching about Germany. It's like it never happened. But they might mention the White Rose students because they were palatable, of course, and they were not socialists and communists, which of whom they never would have mentioned. So in 1986, my co-author and I needed to break through the somewhat, it's not simple-minded, but the somewhat sentimental treatment of the White Rose, which actually Ingersoll never changed significantly. And we came to see that there were a lot of unlikely accounts, things that looked like they were out of order, uh, uh, things that did not acknowledge fully the political content of their leaflets, although she obviously had included them, uh, and rumors that we heard. We knew that she had helped suppress a book that tried to deal with the White Rose in a more complex and interesting manner. She didn't like it, and became very powerful. She became the doyenne of not only the White Rose, but in many ways of German resistance. Uh, there was the greatest literary prize in Germany is called the Geschwister Scholl, the Siblings Scholl Prize. So she was basically all over there promoting, especially Hans and Sophie, when there were other members too to be spoken about. And the family members always put on a friendly front, but they didn't like it, and they knew what was messed up, basically, in her account. So we set out to interview in 1986. We could still find surviving family members of the White Rose, since most of them had been executed and one we couldn't find, and friends. And in doing those interviews, we naturally found out a great deal, including how the other families saw the narrative, uh, what really happened that contradicted some of these stories. And we also looked at the text with a very keen, scholarly, and journalistic eye. And it was obvious that some stories were simply sentimentalized tales, and we included some, we didn't include others. Uh, so the book still, however, did not fully break through all of the legends, and it was not possible to because it was still hard to know what was correct and what wasn't. So that's what we knew in 1986, and that's how we tried to move past it. And also, we tried to move past it by writing a very adult trade book, captivating narrative. The Germans were surprised by it and liked it because they're not used to a kind of an American melding, a dramatization. And it was a dramatization of the story, but strictly factual. We put no words in anybody's mouth, but made it a good read. as it deserved to be.
Jud Newborn, let me ask you a little bit more about the actual work of the White Rose. Was their only role to write and distribute flyers, or did they engage in any other forms of resistance? And tell us about, and how long did they engage in that work?
Okay, well, having transformed from being Hitler Youth, which is a story, which is crucial because it has to do with Hans and his sexuality, um, it took time still to evolve into people who would step over the line from disaffection into active resistance. They were isolated too, let's remember. Nobody was there to help them, and they could easily just be turned into the Gestapo by their neighbors as well, not unlikely to be supported, frankly. So what they did is they started with the leafleting, and their leaflets were unlike anything the Gestapo had ever seen. The Gestapo was used to very left-wing radical tracts coming over the border, addressing workers ideologically. Uh, the White Rose leaflets were addressed to middle-class educated Germans, which was what the White Rose students were. And they used eloquent language. They quoted from Plato and Lao Tzu, and they were passionate and poetic and kind of florid, lofty. They were lofty, but they were also passionate, and they could easily move anybody. In fact, they're very moving if you read them today, more moving than the other kinds of tracks, of course, because, well, for obvious reasons. So they started the leafleting and they issued a staccato burst of these passionate leaflets in June and July of 1942. Uh, in 19 and They had learned that from someone who had gone to the Eastern Front that he witnessed Jews being mass murdered, being shot down into ditches in the Eastern Front. That was called the Holocaust by bullets. That's before death camps were really functioning, although they started. Uh, so they incorporated in leaflet 2 the statement, um, let's not talk about the Jewish question. Let's just say that Jews are human beings, and since the beginning of the war, they have been murdered in the most bestial manner. 300,000. It was really 2 million by then. This is a crime. This is a crime against the dignity of man, unparalleled in human history. That alone was an extraordinary statement, and it really predates the Nuremberg trials coining the notion crimes against humanity. So it's extraordinary. Uh, then the boys, the young men who were mostly medics, were sent off to the Eastern Front from July through November. This was their summer vacation, as it were, having to be at the Eastern Front, fixing amputated legs and all of that, and seeing the Warsaw Ghetto, which they visited, and the misery of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Uh, and When they came back in November, they were radicalized. Now they knew everything from firsthand, and they stepped up the resistance. They wrote another two extraordinary, much more pointed leaflets. Um, and One was issued in the beginning of January. At this point, the boys also went out and they took 3 foot tall stencils of and they took tar-based paint, green and black, and they slashed through on 30 buildings throughout Munich, Hitler the mass murderer, and down with Hitler, and those kinds of things. And of course, the tar-based paper was designed to make it very hard to scrub it off. They did it at the entrance to the university so that students saw these charwomen struggling to get rid of it. And even on the building next to the Brown House, which was the Nazi Party headquarters in Munich. And they did it under pistol cover. So they were really getting ready to protect themselves and to take action in that manner. But still, they were passive resistors. That was active passive resistance for them, and it was active. And the other active aspects were when I have a whole list of the ways in which they suggested that people should do things like sabotaging the war effort. If you're in some kind of a Nazi war munitions factory, sabotage secretly the production of the weapons, and all kinds of things. There's a whole list of ways in which one can do that kind of resistance and be effective without shooting anybody. So they issued those leaflets, and in on February 2nd, 1943, unless it's the third, Stalingrad fell. That was the gigantic defeat of the Nazi troops in the Soviet Union in the winter. Hitler had miscalculated and started the assault on the Soviet Union too late. Uh, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were frozen to death and killed. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, issued on the radio a turning point announcement saying to Germans that we have lost our men at Stalingrad, and played this funereal music. And then came this urge that evolved over the next few weeks of total war. Not let's give up, or this is, they knew it was a turning point, but they wouldn't accept it. Germans knew it was a turning point, and plenty of them accepted it. And so Hans and Sophie thought, well, now morale is deteriorating, and there'd been bombing of cities, and this is our moment to strike. And so, and also, here's things that are not in any of these things. They were taking amphetamines. You know, who wants to say that the White Rose were drug users? But they were taking amphetamines to keep themselves going for day after night, especially Sophie and Hans. And they were also cranking out leaflets. There was no internet in those days. You can't press a button and say, everybody, let's get together and have this big, massive blah, blah. They had to write these leaflets. They had to get the books out. They had to take out paragraphs. They had to think about it. Then they had to get a duplicating machine, which was illegal, strictly illegal, and massive amounts of paper and stamps. And they had to crank and crank and crank. This is very different from today, and all students who might be listening should realize what it took. And on February 18th, 1943, without telling the other group, the members, Hans and Sophie, took 1,000 leaflets packed into a suitcase, and they walked into the University of Munich atrium, a vast atrium, and they put leaflets in outside different classrooms because the students were all simultaneously in class and on different levels because it was a large atrium, went all the way up. And then when they were ready to leave, which was the smartest thing to do and escape, they saw that they had several hundred leaflets left, or 100 leaflets, I believe. And so they climbed back up to the highest gallery, 3 floors up, and they pushed over the balustrade 100 leaflets that came floating down out of the air and down to the floor of the atrium, while the bell rang for the change of class. The students started milling in, looking at this amazing thing and picking them up, and the janitor said, "I spot you," and ran up to them to try to catch them. They tried to merge into the students that were starting to fill up the stairways, and they didn't make it. And he captured them. They denied it was them. He took them off to the rector of the university, which was not an academic, but had an SS officer had been installed. What else? And during that time, some dramatic things happened. And then they were taken to Gestapo prison for 4 days. And the interrogation of the two, the noose of interrogation drew tightly and ever more tightly around their necks so that their prevarications and their denials could no longer hold. And finally, Sophie said, "It's you who have the wrong view, not me, and I would do it all over again." And Hans, I don't know what oh, well, I do know. It's one of the secrets of why they named themselves the White Rose, because they asked him, and that's also very important. And the final thing was they had a trial 5 days later. This hanging judge of the Third Reich was flown down at Hitler's behest to try the White Rose in Munich. And he did what they always do, which was shriek at them, call them parasites. You know, this is not a normal trial, it's a show trial. And Sophie said, when he gave him a chance, what we said and wrote, other people are thinking. They just don't dare open their mouths. And Hans said, where we stand now, you will stand, your heads will roll too. And then they were condemned to death. taken to the prison in the south of Munich. And instead of waiting for 90 days before a death sentence is carried out, Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, ordered that they be immediately executed so that they don't become martyrs. And they were taken out one by one through through the cobblestone courtyard at Gestapo prison. They had a last chance, Hans and Sophie, to say goodbye to their parents. The parents went off to try and get an appeal, but Sophie, Hans, and Christoph Probst, another friend who had written a seventh leaflet that was not yet put together, uh, was arrested. Each one was led separately across the cobblestone center of the courtyard of the prison to a small room. There they were beheaded on the guillotine. When Hans went across the cobblestone center, this young man who had struggled with his homosexuality and promised he would do something great somehow for mankind after he had been arrested and felt he had shamed his parents, he said, he cried out, "Long live freedom, es lebe die Freiheit," which could have been heard by every prisoner behind the Gestapo cell windows in the court. And then he went into the room and was executed.
Well, thank you for that very dramatic story. We're speaking to Jud Newborn, the co-author of the book, um, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. Um, and we'll be back in a few minutes on Out FM. Jud Newborn, author of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. And we want to go back to those two mysteries that we mentioned at the top of the show about the White Rose. And those were, first, what motivated the 1937 transformation of the teenaged Hans and Sophie from fanatical acolytes of Nazism to passionate anti-Nazis? And two, why did Hans and his friends choose the White Rose as the name of their resistance organization? So, Judd, tell us about your later research after the 1986 book was published, that uncovered new documents and led you to conduct your own research about one of the childhood friends of Hans Scholl, all of which began to unravel these mysteries.
I knew that Hans Scholl had been arrested in 1937 for a homosexual relationship. I already knew this in the early 2000s when I needed the Gestapo transcripts and where were they to be. They had been suppressed. Nobody knew about them. Nobody talked about them. I had a friend in Germany, and he had the transcripts, which he had found in Dusseldorf, ignored. He sent them to me. I went through them and I saw that Hans had had a trial in 1937. He and 20 other boys had been rounded up from an alternative youth group he had been in. And he even said to the Gestapo in the transcripts, "I don't know what I was thinking then. I can only explain it was because of my overpowering love for Rolf," and made other similar statements. So he was expressing himself honestly. For Hans, this was traumatic. It was happening in public in a show trial in front of all of his family, friends, and members from his hometown of Ulm. In fact, in letters written to his parents from Gestapo prison, he had said, "I'm sorry for the shame I've brought upon you, and I promise I will become something great for mankind." That means for mankind, and not for the super race. He was rejoining humanity. Hans had written to his parents earlier saying, "I thought I had already washed myself clean of the homosexuality through endless work upon myself." So it came back to him. The urges had been there all along. Uh, at this point, Hans had a blot on his Gestapo record, but they let him go into the military and continue his work and to the university and to study medicine. At the university, he met a mentor, another gay older man who was a bookseller, and had a special, unique relationship where he could confide in him what he could not confide into anyone else. As for the secret of why they called themselves the White Rose, well, it wasn't, nobody knew. And then it wasn't until Gestapo transcripts of the 1943 arrest were discovered after the reunification of Germany. And he said in the transcripts, well, kind of a circuitous and garrulous way, we thought we needed some kind of a name and we chose it arbitrarily and we thought maybe it would resonate and blah, blah, blah. And then he said, I may have been influenced by the Spanish poems of Brentano that I had been reading. Well, as it turned out, and Germans accepted this as the answer. As it turns out, there was no Spanish ballad by Brentano in the early 1800s. In fact, there was a book called The White Rose, Die Weiße Rose, Brett Tra by written by B. Travin, who had, many aliases, and he would send books back in German from Mexico. And one of the books was called Die Weiße Rose. And it's circulated widely among alternative youth groups, and it's quite possibly that Hans read it. You can read about it in my Smithsonian magazine article. In fact, there was a Spanish ballad about the White Rose, but it wasn't from Brentano. It was in the White Rose book by B. Travin, published in 1931, 2831. And it was a beautiful ballad at the very beginning of the book that spoke about the white rose may have withered, but someday it will bloom again, and so forth. The White Rose was, in fact, the name of a hacienda under which there was a great pool of oil. They had an organic community. They were mestizos, interracial. And this theme in this book would have resonated strongly for Hans Scholl and his friend Alexander Schmorell, who were the ones who wrote the leaflets and founded it. Sophie, who has always been focused upon, was the manager of the White Rose. She helped coordinate all of their actions, but she was not actually the writer of it, and she didn't found it, but she was important too. So I believe this is the origin, but I think there's a confluence of possible influences. But I can't tell you all about them now. But there is the symbol of the white rose as a symbol of innocence and purity against the evil darkness of Nazism. So we can't say for sure, but I think this is a pretty good answer.
So, Jud Newborn, a fascinating part of the story that you uncovered is who suppressed the story of Hans's gayness and his earlier criminal prosecution for that. So tell us briefly the story of the role played by his other sister, Inga Scholl, who you mentioned earlier, the fervent Catholic who falsified and erased the reasons for his arrest in 1937 and 38.
Well, the real reason why this wasn't included in the book is because I had discovered it and written it up, but my co-author was turned out to be a bigot, and I hadn't even realized it. And she said to me, I will not allow anything about Hans Scholl's homosexuality to be in this book. I will not allow his homosexuality to besmirch his name and to eclipse his last great words, long live freedom. Es lebe die Freiheit. This to me was an extraordinary betrayal of what it means to be a historian and what it means to be a competent journalist. And I could not move her. So I decided, since I couldn't get it in, that I would keep it separate, publish it under my own name, own the rights to it entirely, and be free to do what I wished with it, which is to make a movie.
You're currently developing the first Hollywood feature film about the White Rose, focusing on Hans, not Sophie, with Academy Award-winning screenwriter Dustin Lance Black, who also wrote the screenplay for Milk about the assassinated San Francisco supervisor Harvey Milk. Tell us about that and when you expect that film will be completed.
Well, there had been 3 films about the White Rose in 1982. They were German art release films that didn't get wide exposure and had subtitles. And none of them they were mostly the legends. Right now, I want to focus on Hans Scholl, not Sophie. It's a more complex and interesting story. and it has everything you need, and it fits with the zeitgeist today. And right now, it's in development. We're working on screenplay drafts. I have interest from several important actors to play crucial roles, and we're moving along. I'm not at liberty to tell more about it, but I'm hopeful that we will get into production as soon as possible because I don't want it to say on my tombstone, he has a film in development. So I've got to get it going.
Indeed, we agree with you. We really want to see that film. So, we want to thank you so much for being a guest on Out FM, Dr. Jud Newborn, the Holocaust historian and the co-author of the 1986 book, now known to be outdated in certain ways, which was Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. We really appreciate your coming on Out FM, and we want to tell our listeners that um, Dr. Jud Newborn performs live, dramatic, richly multimedia storytelling programs worldwide, including his most popular, The White Rose Resistance and Heroes Today in the Fight for Democracy and Human Rights. And he's also co-producing his second Holocaust-themed animated film, Hidden Light, with an award-winning team. And you can get more information on all of this on his website, www.judnewborn, that's JUDNEWBORN.com. And for this link and others, including the link to his Smithsonian article, go to our website, outfm.org. Again, outfm.org. Thank you, Dr. Newborn, for being with us.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.